Go first.
Okay, your name and where you live.
Richard Broders, Discovery Bay. I was born, raised there, still live there. And I have a map of my own. And it's not really a good place for everybody to see it, but it's a 2005 aerial survey that I put together off the county's website. And when I first saw what was going on here, it looked like they were taking in urban areas. And then I traced the map that they had in the paper, and that's in red. And then just recently I found out that about approximately 300 acres, the southern boundary changed, so that's indicated in green. It looked to me like the original was about 3,000 acres, about 1,200 acres of what I would call high density or moderate density, and about 1,800 acres of forest land with no development, or vacant land with no development, or very, very low density. And I was really concerned. I mean, that isn't, the job is supposed to be to, by state law, to designate areas where there's a reasonable likelihood of endangerment. I can read the words. It's not noise, it's not where you don't like shooting, it's where there is a reasonable likelihood. And I've been talking to people, there's a legal definition of that. Now this goes way overboard, and I'm pretty upset about the way it's going. I let it go at Paradise Bay. I knew that was illegal. People didn't come out and say anything. I don't own any property there. I own some property here. So anyway, I drew an area in the middle of that, of some of the property I own. It's in purple. And I included some that Duke, Scholl, and Sterling Huntingford own. Together, it's 300 acres. I have 220 acres of that. And I also own property around it to the west and to the north. And I also own quite a bit of property in the area to be designated in no shooting zone, but I have no problem with. I own some property north of Oak Bay Road there that maybe or maybe not. But I just like to say I have 220 acres and there's another 300. It's gated off. People hunt in there by permission only. And I don't think anybody can make any claim that there's any endangerment to anybody shooting on my 220 acres. So I'd like to say I have a line in the sand drawn around that piece, and it's not going to happen.
Did you point on the map where your line is?
I'll point it out right here. This is the 300 acres. This is the 200 where Scholl's pit is. And if you can't shoot safely there, you can't shoot any place in the world safely. And people shoot in the gravel pit. And that's probably the safest place you could ever find for shooting. You know, and now, so that's my line in the sand. I'm not saying that's where the boundary should be. And I'm not saying, by God, I own this, so I want it around mine. I'm not saying that. I own lots of property that's in. And I've talked to a lot of people, and what I got is, yeah, the area where there's lots of houses and things, absolutely, it's just no-brainer that it should be there. They talk about the other areas. That's absolutely ridiculous, and that's what I hear. And there's a lot of absolutely ridiculous on this map. There is a little gray area, but I'll tell you there's not a lot. Now we look at some of the area, I think the boundary really should be everything south of Oak Bay Road. That's all timberland. There are a few houses. There's a few houses in there, not much. I know there was a little recent development, and the people who did that particularly did not, and they discussed it, put on covenants for no shooting. Somebody, that same person did another development where they had houses closer together, and they put a no shooting clause in the development. I did a little development. I put a no shooting clause in that, and that will probably end up in the no shooting area. And then the stuff to the west there, and I did a little research and I talked to people, and it seems like Mr. Wendell is having a personal agenda to stop shooting in the whole area, whether it's safe or not, and it has to do with noise, and he doesn't like four-wheelers, and on and on and on and on and on.
Hold.
This is public comment.
And that's what I found. And I'm sure there will be a bunch of other people that testify. That's not my issue. I can't really say for sure which parcel should be in or out. I know I've got a line in the sand. And by God, I'm going to make it stick. I'm going to make the county go by the law. And they never have before, and there's no shooting stuff. It's pretty darn clear that it's where there's a reasonable likelihood. So if anybody says there's a reasonable likelihood of endangerment of anybody shooting in my 220 acres of gated off, designated commercial forest land. That's not zoned, but it's designated commercial forest land by the county or the gravel pit. I'm going to contest that as far as I can go, and I've been talking to an attorney, and I believe I can win it. So let's get back to some reasonable stuff that everybody agrees ought to be no shooting. I do. I could point to 1,000, 1,200 acres there that's no shooting. And some of the people in some of those areas, maybe we ought to get together and decide exactly where the boundary is. Now, if you get to the no shooting ordinance, and I happen to give testimony when they adopted a revised no shooting ordinance, and one of my points was that they needed to put in there the language that came from the state law. And they did. They didn't put some other things in I thought were okay, but they did put that in. And I think you all know what it says. Where there is a reasonable likelihood that humans, domestic animals, or property may be jeopardized. There are no humans on my property except if I go out there, cut firewood, hunters, or shoot occasionally. They don't too often, other people do. There's no structures, and there aren't even any structures around it. I mean, really close. The houses are a long ways away, and there's no problem. There's absolutely no problem with that. Now that comes out of the state's law on shooting where the state law preempts any local laws. And not only does it state that, but in the preemption law, it's really clear. It says that they must adopt laws that are consistent with RCW 9.41.300, and that's the one where the reasonable likelihood comes from. And then it goes on to say, and this is actually 941.290, says, and are consistent with this chapter. Such local ordinances shall have the same penalties provided by the state law. Local laws and ordinances that are inconsistent with, more restrictive than, or exceed the requirements of state law shall not be enacted and are preempted and repealed, regardless of the nature of the code, character, or home rule status of such city, town, county, or municipality. Now, I'd like to say that I believe if it's done illegally and it's put on land where there's not a reasonable likelihood, it's an invalid law and is already repealed by the state. So I'd like to tell everybody that I think all the timberland out there at Paradise Bay doesn't have a no shooting ordinance on it in the timberland portion because it's already been repealed by the state law that already existed before the county did this ordinance. Now, as far as the stuff that's to the west there, that's quite controversial. And I think there's enough people here that can decide where the boundaries ought to be. But it appears to me that the stuff south of Elkins Road and west of some line between, the west line of section 12 and the highway there probably should be the boundary. And I know they like well-defined boundaries. Roads make good boundaries. That's why I think Oak Bay Road should be the boundary. And probably some people will have comments that maybe some of the stuff north of Oak Bay Road there as you go toward Indian Island in that direction maybe shouldn't be. And I don't know, I'll let everybody else decide that. I know I just kind of have a rough idea where it should be, but I want to tell you again, I've got a line in the sand and it's around my 220 acres and the 80 acres below it, and it's not going to happen.